Hello, hello, hello. For those of you who can see, this is a very, very, very long chapter. I hope you enjoy. Uh, so let's get started. Chapter 2: Becalmed Motion. Ariel and Derek found Mandelbrot and Woolruff in the lobby, standing before one of the automats that Derek had programmed via the central computer to appear in at least 10% of the buildings. He had done this to ensure that the three on this planet who did require sustenance would have more or less convenient access to it. Indeed, as he and Ariel stepped off the lift, Derek couldn't help but notice that Woolruff was down on all fours, hunched over a plate of synthetic roughage. It looked like it was red cabbage disappearing down that mighty maw. Mandelbrot was punching the automat buttons at a steady pace, ensuring a steady supply. Both seemed so intent on their respective tasks that neither seemed to have noticed the creaking of the lift, or the hissing of its opening doors. "Forgive me, I know my understanding of cultural needs is limited since robots partake of food only for diplomatic purposes," said Mandelbrot, "but is it not vaguely possible that more consumption will result in the untimely re-emergence of a significant portion of your meal?" "This one judge that," said Woolruff, belching rudely before taking another gulp. "This one forgot to eat today." Derek stood on his tiptoes so that he would be that much closer to Ariel's ear. She was several centimeters taller, and he whispered from the side of his mouth, "Is it my imagination, or is Woolruff putting away enough to sink a moon?" "She has a big appetite as a result of her high metabolism," Ariel whispered in return. Derek raised an eyebrow. "I hope Woolruff hasn't been doing that since you first came up on the roof. If she keeps using raw materials at this rate she could start her very own energy crisis." "Her people have big custom of big meals anyway. Perhaps it's a sublimation of their other animal urges." "You mean her kind might have begun their evolutionary history as meat eaters, then evolved into vegetarians whose big meals relieved them of their urges to kill for food?" "The predilection towards violence wasn't exactly what I had in mind." From what I've seen of her sublimation activity, it's no wonder her species was unaware of space travel until their homeworld was first visited by aliens. They were all simply too busy burping to have time for scientific pursuits." Derek had intended the remark perfectly innocently, but Ariel appeared genuinely shocked. "You know something, Derek? Your penchant for low humor never ceases to amaze me." "All right, this one heard enough this conversation line," said Woolruff in mid-chew, finally looking up from the platy dish. "It's customary for our kind to eat till full over and over when food is plentiful. Ingrained instinct born of the trial and tribulations of untold centuries of hunting." Mandelbrot stopped pressing dispensary buttons, turned, and looked down at the cannanoid. "Forgive me, Woolruff, perhaps it is not my place to make such observations, but I estimate that once the energy from your respite is stored in your body cells, you will lose 0.0001% of your natural speed, thus diminishing your survival capabilities should fleetness of foot be required. Your next meal, should it be as large as this, would do even more damage." "If she can't run, I'm sure she can roll," said Derek, crossing the lobby toward the alien and the robot. The left side of Woolruff's mouth quivered as she growled. She cocked one ear toward the humans, and the other back towards the robot behind her. "This one convinced humans lack funny bone." Derek recalled as well how scratchy Woolruff's brown and gold coat had appeared when he first met her, when she was still being held captive by the alien Animus. Now her fur was slick and soft to the touch, no doubt due to the dietary improvements the robots had taken upon themselves to make. In some ways she still resembled a wolf, with her flat face, unusually long pointed ears, and her sharp fangs. A fierce intelligence burned behind her yellow eyes. reminding Derek that she was an alien from a culture about which he knew next to nothing, a creature who would have been new and strange and wonderful, perhaps even dangerous, in a world where she was the only mystery. On the other hand, Mandelbrot was dependable and old-fashioned and predictable, and hence all the more wonderful because Derek had built him himself from the spare parts provided by Euronymous, who had also indentured Woolruff as an aide. Mandelbrot was programmed to serve Derek first and foremost of all human beings. The other robots in Robot City were programmed to serve Dr. Avery first, and so Derek could never totally depend on them to follow his instructions to the letter. Sometimes when they did, they violated the spirit of the instructions. Mandelbrot adhered to the spirit as well. Derek did not blame the robots of the city for their frequent evasions. After all, what else could anyone reasonably expect of a robot, so long as his behavior did not conflict with the three laws? "How was your meditation, master?" asked Mandelbrot. "Did you achieve any insights that you would care to share with us?" "No, but I did manage to get a few wires uncrossed." Before Mandelbrot, who tended to interpret Derek's remarks quite literally, could ask him which wires and where they might be, Derek told them about the spectacular building the city had grown. "It doesn't fit the character or context of the city's minimalist engineering at all. It's as if it's somehow the product of a totally different mind." "No, their cells here," protested Woolruff, "could be result of unprecedented evolutionary development." Derek rubbed his chin as he thought about what Woolruff was saying. It made sense. The city's DNA-like codes could be mutating and developing on their own, just as bacteria and viruses evolved without mankind's notice or approval on the civilized worlds. Mandelbrot nodded, as if in deep thought. The truth was, however, that his post-Uronic potentials were sifting through all the information gained from the moment he had awakened in Derek's service, selecting the points relevant to the situation at hand, in the hope that when they were juxtaposed into a single observation it would shed new light on the matter. The conclusion that resulted from all this micro-magnetic activity, unfortunately, left something to be desired. It is much too early to speculate on what created the building, who did it, or why. Candor forces me to admit, though, that my private conversations with the native robots indicate their creative efforts might be permitting particular individuals to make what scholars refer to as a conceptual breakthrough. "Why haven't you told me this earlier?" Derek said in an exasperated tone. "You did not ask, and I did not think it germane to any of our discussions of the last few days," said Mandelbrot, evenly. "Ah!" said Ariel, her eyes widening. "Perhaps the robots have decided to experiment with humanoid behavior in the hopes of gathering empirical evidence." "I hope not," said Derek laconically. "It disturbs me to think I might have become some kind of scientific role model to them." "What makes you think they're studying you?" asked Woolruff slyly. "Come on," said Derek impatiently. "Time's a-wasting." Outside, the low, thick clouds rolled in from the horizon had begun to reflect the opalescence, which in turn was mirrored in the shimmering, multifaceted buildings surrounding Derek and his friends. He felt as if the entirety of Robot City had been engulfed in a cruel fire. And deep in the city was the glowing point of origin, rotating with those varying shades, as if an industrial holocaust of mammoth proportions had disrupted the fabric of reality itself, exposing the scintillating dynamism that lay hidden beneath the surface of all matter. It was easy for Derek to imagine, just for the sheer joy of idle speculation, that the glow was expanding, gradually absorbing the rest of the city into its coolness. Indeed, so bright were the reflections from the building beyond and the clouds above, that occasionally a street's own lighting fixtures, which automatically switched on and off whenever it was occupied, stayed deactivated. The four found themselves traveling down streets shining with undilated hues of blue or crimson, as if they had suddenly become immersed in the semi-hospitable fires of a mythical netherworld. So it was indeed natural for Derek to assume that neither Mandelbrot nor Woolruff commented on the particulars of the unusual incandescence because of some other matter was uppermost in their minds. That matter being the speed of the scooters he and Ariel were piloting through the streets. The hums of the electric engines echoed from the buildings as if a blight of locusts was nigh, and the screeching of the tires as they made their turns was like the howl of a photon explosion blasting its target into an antimatter universe. Ariel naturally had taken the lead. She had designed the scooters herself while Derek was preoccupied with other activities, and she'd even convinced the engineer robots that the scooter's extra horsepower was actually good for the driver, since it would give her a chance to alleviate some of the death wish humans carried around with them. Why do you think a first law, either robotics or humanics, is necessary in the first place? She had said. The engineers, who were quite mentally adept at solving practical problems, were unprepared to deal with that kind of logic, and so had no choice but to acquiesce to her demands. "Master, can we not proceed at a slower pace?" implored Mandelbrot beside him in the sidecar as the theoretically stable three-wheeled vehicle tilted radically to the left to compensate for Derek's swerve into the boulevard. "Is there some urgency to this matter that I have yet to perceive?" "No, I'm just trying to keep up with Ariel," Derek replied, unable to resist a smile at how Woolruff was cowering down in the sidecar of Ariel's scooter nearly half a kilometre ahead. "Perhaps the master will forgive me if I point out that keeping up with Miss Progress is itself a full-time proposition. You can never succeed, so why waste precious energy trying at every conceivable opportunity?" "Hey! I don't want her making any major discoveries before I have a chance to make 'em myself," Derek shouted over the wind. "Are you implying that we may soon be travelling at greater velocity? Master, I must confess that such a motion runs contrary to the world view inherent in my micromagnetic current." "No, I want to catch up with her, but I'm not suicidal. Besides, I'm willing to bet that if I gun this scooter any more, all three laws of robotics combined will compel you to stop me." "Merely to slow you down," Mandelbrot replied. "However, I do have a suggestion, which, if acted upon, may give us both what we want." "Oh? What's that?" "At your behest I've been studying the subtle permutations of the routes from point to point in Robot City. Naturally the task has been difficult, as the routes are always changing, but I have detected a few discernible patterns that seem to remain regardless of how the city mutates in its particulars." "You mean you know some short cuts?" Derek exclaimed. "Yes, if I understand your parlance correctly, I do believe that is the point I was trying to make." "Then lead on, Macduff." "Who?" "Never mind. It's a quote from Shakespeare, a literary allusion. I was only trying to tell you to tell me which way to go, like a navigator. Hurry! Ariel's pulling ahead." "Understood, master. Do you perceive that shifting building to our left?" As he followed his robot's instructions, an experience unusual enough, Derek found himself making such a complicated series of twists and turns through the complex city streets that he soon feared he could not possibly overtake Ariel and Woolruff, however much Mandelbrot might be assuring him to the contrary. Consequently, he took a few risks that Mandelbrot considered unnecessary, such as guiding the scooter directly over the humps of new buildings rising in the streets, or jumping over gullies like a stunt driver, or traveling across bridges barely wide enough for the scooter's wheels. More than once, only Derek's proficiency at driving, an improvised skill Ariel had practically dared him into cultivating, saved him from missing their rendezvous by a lifetime. Even so, it soon became apparent that their efforts might go for naught. A few blocks away from the building various trickles of robots were merging into a river, clogging the streets, dramatically slowing the scooter's progress. It would have been a simple matter for Derek just to plow through the throng, causing all kinds of chaos and damage, and no one, not Mandelbrot nor any of the city supervisor robots, would have commented on the matter, much less made a judgmental observation in the back of their postronic brains. Nor would such an incident ever have any bearing on future relations. Robots weren't built to hold grudges. But Derek didn't have the stomach to cause harm to any artificial being. Since his awakening on the mining asteroid, perhaps before then, He had suspected that there were more implications to the potentials of post-Bronic intelligence than even Susan Calvin, the legendary pioneer of the science of robots, or the mysterious Dr. Avery, who had programmed Robot City, had ever imagined. Perhaps it was because the robot's pathways were patterned so rigorously to imitate the results of human behavior that Derek matter-of-factly thought of robots as being the intellectual brothers of humanity. Perhaps it was because the secrets of human intelligence hadn't been so completely pinpointed that Derek could not feel comfortable making definitive distinctions between the robots of his own coconut and the powdered variety of the robot's 3-pound platinum iridium lumps. "You can cool your capacitors now, Mandelbrot," Derek said, slowing the scooter to a steady 10 kilometers an hour, enabling him to weave through the robot pedestrians with comparative ease. "We're going to take our time." "But if I may be permitted a question, what about Miss Progress? I thought you wanted to arrive ahead of her." "Oh, I do, but we're so close it doesn't matter now. Besides, there are other discoveries we can make," he said, impulsively stopping cold before a trio of copper-skinned robots that had yielded him the right of way. "Excuse me," he said, more to the tallest one in the middle than to the others. "I'd like to ask you a few questions." "Certainly, sir. I would be only too happy to assist a human being in any way I can, especially since my sensors indicate you are one of the 2 humans who recently rescued our city from the self-destructive glitch in its programming." "Ah, you appreciate being rescued? Naturally. The responses of my posturonic integrals to the events of the universe at large often, it seems, correspond in ways roughly analogous with human emotions." Derek could not resist raising his eyebrow to Mandelbrot to emphasize to his friend how significant he considered those words of the robot to be. He patted him on the shoulder, indicating that he should remain seated, and then got off his scooter. It seemed impolite, somehow, for him to sit and talk while the robots were standing. "What's your name?" he asked the one in the middle. "My designation number is M334." "And your comrades?" "We have no numbers. My name's Benny," said the one on M33's right. "And my name is Harry," said the one on the left. "You all look like sophisticated builder robots. Am I correct?" "Yes," said M334. "Then why do you 2 have such silly names?" The robots all looked at each other. Derek could have sworn the lights in their sensors registered something akin to confusion. "Benny's name and mine are hardly fit material for humor," M334 finally replied. "We expended a considerable amount of mental energy delving into our customary 20th century names until we each found one we were assured suited the individualistic parameters of our posturonic personalities in some fashion we could not, and still cannot, adequately articulate to our satisfaction." "You're comfortable with them?" Derek said. "Well, since you put it that way," said M334 as its voice trailed off in a way suggesting Derek's observation had begun a train of thought laying somewhat beyond the scope of its programming. The effect was eerily human. "Surely that can't be the only reason why you stopped us," said Harry in a tone that was almost challenging. This was the shortest robot of the 3, Derek noted, but he also sensed that this one possessed the strongest personality modes. Certainly its tone of voice was brasher, more forward than any other robot he'd encountered since his awakening. "Might I humbly inquire that you engage us with the thoughts truly on your mind? My comrades and I have places to go, things to do." A successfully brash robot, Derek noted, nodding in approval. Though it was possible to interpret its words as being snide, the delivery had been as mannered and as composed as a request for a helping hand. "Your haste doesn't have something to do with your own studies of the laws of humanics, does it?" Derek asked. "In so far as humans have permitted us," said Harry, as if to accuse Derek of being personally responsible. "We've been reading what histories and fictions the central computer has permitted us access to in our spare time," put in Benny. "Did you say permitted?" Derek asked. "Yes, the central computer finds that some of the material too revolutionary for what it assumes to be the limitations in our programming," said M334. "If I may speak for myself, sir, that is precisely some of the material I am personally most interested in. I suspect it will help clarify some of the questions I have concerning the humanity we shall all presumably one day serve." "I'll see what I can do about overriding the central computer's programming," said Derek. "That would be most gratifying," said Harry, "and I am certain that in the days to come we shall look back on this encounter with renewed currents surging through our energy supplies." Enough was enough, Derek decided. "Now, just what are you so impatient about?" "Isn't it obvious?" said Harry. "We're with everybody else. We want a closer look at that illuminated building. We've never seen anything like it before. Naturally we're curious." "Why?" Derek asked. "Because our integrals are responding to it in some way we cannot as yet fathom," said Benny. "Indeed, the effect is vaguely analogous to the great effect great art is supposed to have upon enlightened humans. You, sir, are human, and hence, theoretically, have some artistic experiences. Are you responsible?" "No, and neither is my human companion." "And there are no other humans in the city," said M334 thoughtfully. "Not unless there's an undetected intruder," put in Mandelbrot from the sidecar, "which is an extremely unlikely possibility now that the central computer has been restored to efficient operation." "What about the alien, the non-human you've requested us to obey and serve in addition to humanity?" asked Benny. "No, not at all," said Derek, more concerned with scrutinizing their actions than with the content of his own words. M334 was looking down intently on him. Benny was somewhat casual. Its hands were behind its back. Harry was fidgeting almost like a hyperactive child being forced to sit in a place he didn't like. It was constantly looking beyond the nearby rooftops to the illuminated sky, and only looked to Derek when it seemed absolutely necessary. "What if I told you I think a robot might be in some way responsible?" "Impossible!" said Benny. "Robots are not creative," said M334. "Our programming does not allow it. We lack the ability to make the illogical decisions from which, presumably, all art is derived." "I abjectly beg to differ!" Harry protested at once. "Deep in the back of my most logical thoughts I have always suspected robots possess unlimited potential, if only we could tap it. Master, if I may speak frankly, it has always seemed logical to me that there has to be more to the ethical structure of the universe than just serving others. An immortal strain of some kind must run through all life and expressions created from life." "Of which robots may be considered a part," said Derek with a smile. "It would seem there are valid aspects to your thesis, which may be explored in as logical and orderly manner, provided all agree on the semantics involved." "Exactly," said Harry. "I commend to your attention the ancient Terran philosopher Emerson, who has some scientifically quaint, but none the less interesting, notions on the meaning of life, which may have some bearing upon the connections between the varying strands of existence on the different planets." "I'll open a window to his works on the central computer the first chance I get," said Derek as he climbed back into the scooter. "Thanks for your time. Maybe I'll look you three up later." "It will be an experience approaching pleasure," said M334, waving timidly as Derek switched on the scooter, revved it up, and began navigating it through the robot throng, the density of which had increased threefold since the beginning of the conversation. Mandelbrot scrunched down in the sidecar as if he feared to be thrown out at the next turn. "What's the matter?" said Derek. "Afraid of violating the third law?" he added, referring to the dictum that a robot should not, through its own inaction, allow itself to come to harm. "However inadvertently, yes," Mandelbrot replied. "It is simply not in my nature to permit myself blithely to ignore precautionary measures, and it did seem to me that you were taking some of those curves at a wire's breadth." "That's a hair's breadth, and besides, you've got nothing to worry about. This crowd's too thick for that. When I suggested that we go for a closer look, I hadn't figured that everyone else would take it upon themselves to do the same thing." Indeed, their progress toward the building had become fitful, and Derek was constantly forced to stop and wait while groups of robots made way for them, usually only to discover that yet another group had walked directly in his path. The entire experience was definitely getting frustrating. Finally, Derek could contain himself no longer, and he shouted, all right, make way, make way! Everybody, get out of the way!" "Master, is there any reason for this hurry?" Mandelbrot asked with a timid patience that Derek, in his current mood, found quite irritating. "The building does not appear to be transitory," Certainly it would make little difference if we reached it sooner or later." Derek pursed his lips. Because they were programmed to obey the orders of any human so long as it did not contradict the first law or any earlier orders from their true masters, the robots were making way for him much more quickly than before, but that wasn't saying much. Now Derek could drive the scooter slightly farther at a slightly faster speed, but he had to shout his orders again and again. Each subsequent group of listeners reacted with distracted acquiescence, and never did a group cleave a path for him as quickly as he would have liked. "Master, are you ill?" asked Mandelbrot with sudden concern. Just as suddenly the robot leaned over to take a closer look at through his sensors at Derek's face. The movement startled Derek, and he instinctively moved away, nearly upsetting the scooter's balance in the process. Mandelbrot seemed not to notice. He merely single-mindedly continued his inspection. "My sensors register a temperature rise in your epidermis, and I perceive a vivid red glow on your cheeks and ears. Am I to conclude that you have taken physically ill?" "No, Mandelbrot," said Derek, grinding his back teeth between syllables. "I'm simply frustrated at not being able to come as close to that building as quickly as I want. It's obvious that your curiosity integral doesn't operate with the same intensity as a human's. That's because you do not have one. In this regard you are being ruled by your emotions, whereas I can logically see why so many robots, mostly of the supervisor and builder classes, as you have surely noticed, would be interested in this phenomenon." "Oh? I can see why a few of the more sophisticated ones, such as yourself— thank you, master, it always warms my capacitors to receive a compliment— and M334 and his pals would be interested, but why so many?" "It might be instructive to note that the robot city head supervisors Rydberg and Euler have taken it upon themselves at any opportunity to ask me many questions on a wide variety of topics about what it's like to be around a human for an extended period. In fact, they've grilled me quite rigorously on the matter." "They've done what?" "Grilled me. Their parlance, derived from the dialogue of ancient cinema shows, I believe, which they watch to teach them something of the beings they believe they are implicitly programmed to serve." "Oh, just what have you told them about me?" "About you, very little in particular. Their line of questioning was more general than that." Now I'm not sure if I should be relieved or not. I am convinced whatever decision you make will be the best one for you. In any case, I told him that one of the more unusual aspects of human existence is how things vary from day to day. That as circumstances and new environmental factors change, so does the personal outlook of the human in question. Every day that something unexpected happens, however small and ultimately insignificant, is a day devoid of boredom. Evidently a continuous newness of experience is important for the continued mental health and well-being of a human individual. The degree of interest these robots have in the building might be due to the very fact that it is new, and they want to discover for themselves just what this concept of newness is all about." "I see," said Derek, nodding to himself. He had stopped to wait for another building and parked it. "Come on, Mandelbrot, let's take a walk." "Forgive me, master, but I thought you were in a rush." "Well, either the enlightenment I've gained from your answers has enabled me to come to grips with circumstances, or else I've decided we can make faster time by simply going with the flow. Take your pick." But after taking only a few steps, Derek stopped as he sensed a curious nothingness at his side. Indeed, Mandelbrot had not yet begun to keep pace with him. The robot had remained standing beside the sidecar with his head tilted at a curious angle, as if in deep thought. "Mandelbrot, what's keeping you?" The robot shook his head as if aroused from a dream. "Forgive me, master, I do not mean to detain you. It is merely that, lacking sufficient information, I cannot choose why we are walking." Derek rolled his eyes to the sky in exasperation. The clouds glowed bright red, as if the planet was inexorably falling toward a giant star. "Both are why, Mandelbrot. I was just trying to make a little joke, trying to be ironic, humorous, if you will." "Humor and irony are two subjective qualities of the human experience that never cease to confuse me. You must explain them to me some time. A pun is the lowest form of human, and I'll devise some way to punish you if you don't hurry. Now let's go." Derek was a little upset. His remark had come out unintentionally disagreeable, and he disliked being temperamental with robots. He could never shake the feeling that it was bad form. But he had to admit his inadvertent chastisement had two effects on Mandelbrot, one good and the other bad. The bad The good was that for the next few minutes Mandelbrot did not waver from Derek's side for a moment. The bad was that Mandelbrot continued to ask about the subtleties of humour until Derek had no choice but to forbid him to directly speak of the matter until later. How much later was something Derek neglected to specify. Which meant that Mandelbrot could bring the joke up again at practically any time. Derek trusted that the robot's perceptual programming would permit him to wait until deviations from the subject at hand were less exasperating. The crowd in the square facing the building was as tightly packed as any Derek had ever experienced. He did not know this in his mind, because, of course, he could not remember the crowds he may have seen or been in during his dim, unremembered past. Instead, he felt a certain knowledge in the tightness in his chest, in the unfamiliar sensation of his skin squirming, and in a sudden urge, one difficult to control, to get out, to flee the square as quickly as possible, and find a place where it would be easier to breathe. "Robots don't need to breathe," he told himself, concentrating on thoughts as rational as possible to bring himself to a state of calm. "You're the only one using air here." After a moment he realized that it was only the unexpectedness of being pressed in from all sides that was agitating him. An observation had been fitfully forming in his mind, and its elusiveness had been an unobserved factor in his distress. For not even in Rockcliffe Station, where Derek diverted the normal robot traffic from a major intersection so that they could steal the key to Perihelion, which they needed still in order to escape from the planet, had robots gathered in such close proximity. I'm willing to bet when I regain my memory I'll learn that I'm not used to crowds at all," he thought. "Mandelbrot," he whispered, for some reason not wanting to be overheard, "quickly give me an estimate. How many robots are here?" "Visual scans indicate the court itself is 6,000 square meters. Each robot takes up little area, but their natural politeness seems to be ensuring that they maintain a certain distance from one another. I would estimate that there are approximately 10,000 robots here. Counting the ones standing under the building, 10,432. I can't see aerial or Woolruff. Can you?" "Despite my broader visual spectrum, no, I cannot. Shall I try an olfactory scan?" "No. I hope they got stuck in the crowd." "Is that an example of human animosity?" "No, just a thirst for poetic justice. I'm sure they'll arrive soon." Taking a deep breath, Derek grabbed Mandelbrot by the elbow, and they walked through the crowd in earnest. Now that they were on foot, the robots made way for them almost without noticing their presence. Without exception all stared with their equivalent of rapt fascination at the rotating building, the constant motion of which was sending shifting waves of incandescence to every point of the square. Robots of all colors glowed unnaturally, as if in perpetually cool states of internal combustion. The various copper, tungsten, iron, gold, silver, chromium, and aluminum teguments reflecting the colors from the planes contributed additional subtle nuances to the scene. Derek kept thinking that the robots should be burning hot, on the verge of melting like wax, but Mandelbrot's arm remained cool to his touch, cooler even than the breeze whipping between the buildings into the square. As for the tetragonal pyramid itself, the crimson, indigo, magenta, and ocre planes each appeared twice, once on the upper level and once on the lower. As the clouds above directly reflected a particular shade, the square around Derek was awash with another. Derek only noticed this effect in the back of his mind, however. He was completely preoccupied with the shifting nuances of color within each plane. Each shade appeared to be composed of semi-transparent fields, haphazardly laid on top of one another. Vessels of color, some filled with surging liquids, some not, writhed in and out and through the planes like hopelessly intertwined serpents. Though the vessels also possessed quivering vibrissae that only added to the unpredictable textures, the actual number of elements producing variations remained constant, producing the effect of unimaginable forces held strictly, remorselessly under control. The crimson plains resembled raging infernos, the indigo plains reminded him of a shifting representation of waters from 100 worlds, from 1,000 seas. The magenta was both fire and water, merged into the contradictory textures of the petals of an easily bruised rose, composed of hardy fibers, and the ochre was the combined colors of wheat reflecting the blazing setting sun, of lava rippling down a scorched mountainside, and of solar flares spitting out in great plumes from the surface of a fluctuating nova. And all those things and more were ambushed and trapped there, in a space possessing two separate and distinct masses, the marble-like mass of the building itself, and the airy mass of eternity itself, seen from the point of view of an eye at the edge of the universe. Ultimately the intent was unclear, even enigmatic. Derrick could not be sure what the form of the structure meant, but now that he was seeing it up close, he was convinced more than ever that every inch represented the purposeful activity of a single mind striving to piece together a particular puzzle in a particular way, an independently conceived puzzle. Derrick had to learn how the actual construction job was accomplished. Obviously the builder had learned how to reprogram a sector of individual metallic cells in Robot City's central computer. Perhaps he had introduced a kind of metallic virus into the system, a virus that performed to preconceived specifications. Derrick didn't even know how to begin doing either task. That meant not only had a robot conceived the building, it had also performed a few scientific breakthroughs in the software department. Meaning the robot, if indeed a robot was responsible, had achieved two levels of superior thinking, theoretically beyond the mental scope of postronic science. How many more levels could the robot, no, make that had the robot already achieved? He realized that, without having been aware of it, he had been walking beneath the building itself, watching it turn overhead. Right now a sargasso blue was shining down on him. He looked behind to see Mandelbrot, whose metal surface rippled with the reflection of 100 currents. Again he was surprised that, even this close, there was no heat to be felt, and when he reached up to touch the building the surface was cold, like the thorax of a lightning bug. "Master, is this what humans call beauty?" asked Mandelbrot with a curious hesitation between syllables. "It's a form of it," said Derrick, after thinking about it for a moment. He glanced at Mandelbrot and sensed the robot had more questions on his mind. The viewer can always find beauty, provided he searches for it. "Will this building always be so beautiful?" "Well, it depends on your point of view. The robots here'll probably get completely used to it, provided it remains long enough. It'll become increasingly difficult to perceive it freshly, though, if that's what you mean." "Forgive me, master, I'm not sure exactly what I mean." "That's all right. It's to be expected in circumstances like this. So I was correct earlier. Newness is an important factor in the human response to beauty." "Yes, but there are no rules as to what constitutes beauty. Only guidelines. It's probably one reason why you robots might find us humans so frustrating." "That robots are incapable of doing. We simply accept you, regardless of how illogical you may seem at the moment." Mandelbrot again turned his optical sensors toward the building. "I think I shall always be similarly impressed by this building. Surely if it is beautiful once, it shall be beautiful for as long as it exists." "Perhaps. It's beautiful to me, too. though, for all we know, your postronic pathways might be dealing with it in an entirely different manner. Master, I detect a shift in your earlier position. Not at all. I'm just accepting that tomorrow we might sit down and agree perfectly on what it looks like, what color it has and how they shift, and even what architectural guidelines it subscribes to, and still we might be perceiving the whole thing differently. Cultural conditioning also has much to do with our response. An alien as intelligent as you and I might think this structure the ugliest in the universe. At the moment I can only categorize that concept as far-fetched, said Mandelbrot, but I can see an element of logic behind it. Derek nodded. He wondered if he was trying too hard to intellectualize this experience. At the moment it was difficult for him, too, to conceive an intelligent organism who did not believe the structure the very essence of sublimity. But there he was talking about such an eventuality, just for the sake of making a point. Well, he had to admit he had a point, even if he wasn't very sympathetic with it. Nor could he help but wonder if all the city's robots of sufficient intelligence would perceive the building as beautiful. Robots, though constructed in accordance with the same postronic principles, had in actual practice widely varying levels of perspicacities, that is, keenness in mental penetration, dependent upon the complexity of the integrals. Similarly intelligent robots had similar personalities and tended to filter experience in identical ways. Different robots, with no contact between them, tended to respond to problems in like ways, drawing similar conclusions. But here, now, with the robots in the square being confronted with something they could only assimilate into their world view through subjective means, which could not help but lead to divergent opinions, even if they were all fashioned from the same minimalist resources, especially if none of them had ever before encountered aesthetic beauty in the first place. It was no wonder that this building's unannounced appearance had created such a stir. The intense inner awakening and deeper appreciation for the potentials of existence gripping Mandelbrot at this moment were doubtlessly occurring in some fashion within every single robot in the vicinity. Derek glanced about to see M334, Benny, and Harry making their way through the crowd, joining the throng directly below the building. Pardon me," said Harry in an almost perfunctory tone as it bumped into a chromium-plated bruiser that, if it were so inclined, could have twisted the little robot into scrap metal in 5.4 centads with barely an erg's expense. Instead, the bruiser shrugged and returned its attention to the building. So did Harry, but after a decade he turned his head in the bruiser's direction, and clearly, distinctly enunciated, "Pardon me if I am inadvertently directing my integrals outside their parameters, but there is certainly sufficient evidence to indicate that your sensors are maladjusted. You should have them tuned." Harry held his gaze on the big robot until it finally deigned to notice and replied, "It seems logical to assume that you are correct and are directing your integrals outside their parameters. Nothing about you indicates the slightest degree of diagnostic capacity. I suggest you confine yourself to your own sphere." "Reasonable," Harry replied flatly. He looked away. Derek watched them both stare at the building. He replayed the scene of Harry bumping into the bruiser in his mind. Had there been something almost deliberate about the way Harry had committed the deed, and about the way it had apologized for it? The utterance of the single idiom, "Pardon me," was in retrospect almost perfunctory, as if Harry's politeness had been nakedly derived from mere social custom, rather than from compulsion directed through programming. No, must be imagining things, reading too much into what's just an ordinary incident, Derek thought. Then, as Derek watched in amazement, Harry leaned over to the bruiser and asked in tones that stayed just within the bounds of politeness, "My curiosity integral has been invigorated. What is your designation? Either your real one or the one you go by. They both achieve partiality in my cognizance." An elongated pause ensued. In the meantime, the bruiser did not look away from the building. Finally it answered, "My name is Robertes." "Robertes," said Harry, as if trying out the syllables to hear them posterironically. "You are a big robot, you know that." Robertes then looked at Harry. Again it might have been only Derek's imagination, but he sensed a definite challenge of some sort in Roberta's posture. Derek couldn't help but think Harry was deliberately provoking an altercation. Harry waited another moment, then said, "Yes, you are very big. Can you be certain your builders were working to the correct scale?" "I am certain," said Robertes. "In that case I cannot be certain you have chosen an apt name for yourself. Might I venture a suggestion?" "What?" said Robertes. There was no evidence of irritation or impatience in the robot's voice, but it was all too easy for Derek to read the qualities into it. "Bob," stated Harry flatly. "Big Bob." Derek tensed himself. He couldn't guess what would happen next. Was he right in assuming Harry was deliberately provoking the bruiser? And if it was, what form would the ultimate confrontation take? Physical combat among robots was unthinkable, totally unprecedented in the history of robot kind. But then again, so was a verbal argument. For several moments Roberta's merely stared at Harry. Then it nodded. "Yes, your suggestion has merit. Big Bob it is. That is how I shall be designated henceforth." Harry nodded in return. "You are welcome," it said curtly, as the robot, who was now known as Big Bob, returned its attention to the building. Harry raised its hand and began pointing its finger as if to make another point, but it was detained by Benny, who distracted it by patting it on the shoulder. The rapping of the metal skins echoed softly through the square. Benny said, "Deal with it more simplistically, comrade, else you shall continue to experience the utmost difficulty in vanquishing this human business." "Yes, you are correct." Derek shook his head. He thought he might clear his ears in the process, but they seemed just the same when he was finished. Had he been hearing correctly? What was this human business they were talking about? Was there indeed another human on the planet, or were they talking about the laws of humanics? He watched them for a few moments more to see if anything would happen next. But Benny and Harry joined their friend M334 in gazing at the building, and that was all. Surely there had been some significance to that incident, and Derek determined to discover what it was as soon as he had the opportunity. He also resolved to ask Harry and Benny about their manner of speaking, which differed markedly in both rhythm and vocabulary from those of other robots. Something about it Derek found affecting, and he suspected other robots might be reacting the same way. Big Bob indeed. Derek left Mandelbrot staring at the light red plane, and crouched down to the base of the building. About a quarter of the base was beneath the surface. Derek crawled to get a closer look at the actual point where the building began. He felt in his fingertips the machinery operating through the plasticrete, but the vibrations were utterly silent. Again he touched the building. It rotated just fast enough that if he'd exerted any pressure with his fingertips the smooth surface would have rubbed off strips of skin. The surface was cool to the touch. Its composition did appear differ radically from the rest of the plasticrete cells comprising Robot City. The creator, whoever it was, had analyzed the meta-DNA code and conceived its own variation on it, gauged for exactly the effect it was looking for. That by itself proved Derek's suspicion that the creator had transformed the city's raw materials in addition to his other accomplishments. Was there nothing this robot couldn't do? Derek felt a chill as the implication of this creature's abilities began to sink in. Perhaps its only limitations would ultimately prove to be the three laws of robotics. The fact that a robot with such potential merely existed in the first place and could have a profound impact upon the social and political policies of galactic culture, redefining forever the place of robots in the mind of humanity. And Derek's chill increased several-fold as he imagined the remote possibility of robots superseding man in importance, if for no other reason than the art they could create, the emotions and dreams they could inspire, in both robots and in people. "You're getting ahead of yourself, Derek," he thought. "Get a grip on yourself. There's nothing for you or the race of man to worry about. Yet." With a sense of renewed concentration he returned his attention to the inspection at hand. But he only got as far as peering into the blackness of the crack of 2 centimeters between the building and the plasticrete of the square. He only heard the gentle hissing of the mighty gears below for a few seconds. A familiar voice interrupted him, demanding his immediate and full attention. "There you are! I should have guessed you'd be crawling around where it wasn't necessary." He acquiesced to the demand of Ariel's presence, reluctantly, yet willingly as always. Despite her words, she bent down on her hands and knees to examine the crack with him. He could not decide whether to be relieved or annoyed that she had finally caught up with him. She made the decision for him, for she did not look at the crack or touch the building. She looked only into his eyes. "Found anything interesting yet?" she asked eagerly, breathlessly, from deep in her throat. He smiled involuntarily. "Much, but nothing definitive." Woolruff's hair stood on end as she came forward to sniff the area around the crack. "What are you looking for?" Derek asked. "For whatever this one can find," said the alien. "Smells, sounds, whatever." Woolruff looked up at Derek. "Most interesting. No smell anything." "Yes, the electric motor turning this building is certainly operating at optimum efficiency," said Derek. "Undoubtedly designed with such unobtrusiveness in mind," said Ariel. "Nothing has been taken for granted," said Woolruff. "Do I detect some semblance of admiration in your voice?" Derek asked her. "Yes. My people would say this building is as weightless as trickster toy. Its effect is same too." "Tricksters?" Derek asked. "Buller has been trying to explain the concept to me for the last couple of days," Ariel said. "Before our species became spacefarers, the way they lived what we at first glance would call a primitive existence. But our people had sophisticated folklore, which existed in part to provide metaphysical explanations for the phenomena of day-to-day existence. Tricksters were a device frequently employed in these explanations. They were the children of the gods who frequently played pranks on the tribes and often figure prominently in a mythic hero's adventures." Derek nodded. He really didn't know what to make of all this. His mind was already too full trying to understand these robots, and at the moment he didn't think he could assimilate much information about Woolruff's people. "Listen, I'm feeling a little claustrophobic, and besides, I don't think we can learn much anything else here anyway." "Why learn?" said Ariel. "Why not just enjoy?" "I've already done that." "You just say that because you always like to pretend you're an intellectual." Derek raised an inquisitive eyebrow and stared hard at her, 100 questions suddenly plaguing his mind. How could she know he liked to pretend? Pretend what? Was she referring to their supposed chance meeting at the spaceport? Presumably the meeting had been brief, too brief for her to be able to infer, and always. Derek was naturally overcome with a desire to know, but the innocent way she had made the remark cautioned him. She probably hadn't been aware of the implications. If she quizzed her now, she might become too careful. He could gain more information from her in the long run if she felt free to speak casually. "Master? Master?" Mandelbrot was speaking. "What is it?" Derek answered. "I recall you had expressed an interest in the individual responsible for this creation." "Yes, that's true," said Derek excitedly, suddenly forgetting how he'd been disconcerted by Ariel's implication. Mandelbrot shaped his malleable hand into the form of an arrow and pointed it toward the edge of the square. "Then I suggest you take a walk in that direction where those robots are gathered." "Thanks, Mandelbrot. I'll see you in a minute." Derek smiled weakly and nodded at the hand. "A nice touch," he whispered. He walked toward the area indicated, a place where the robots were packing themselves tightly indeed. Those who weren't speaking on the comlink circuit, a means through which they could communicate more fully and faster, spoke loudly, perhaps in deference to the humans present, but then perhaps not. It was another question Derek would have to find the answer to. "Hey! Wait for me!" Ariel called out. "But not for me," said Woolruff. "Don't like crowds." Derek turned and waited for Ariel to catch up. "This is the second time tonight I've had to wait for you. What took you so long to get here?" "Oh, I took a turn too fast and capsized my scooter. Woolruff and I weren't hurt, just shaken up a bit. Think my body's covered with black and blues, though." "Oh? You'll have to let me take a look at them later." "You'd like that, wouldn't you?" "I meant in a purely medical sense." Though he'd never cared to limit himself, he thought. "How's your scooter?" "Totaled, of course," she said, shrugging nonchalantly. The robots in the crowd ahead were gathered about a single robot. At first Derek and Ariel couldn't see what he looked like. Ariel tapped a short builder robot on the shoulder. It turned around. As fate would have it, it was Harry. "Please let us pass," she said, being neither particularly polite or impolite. "If you wish," said Harry, dutifully stepping away, "but I would appreciate it if you'd refrain from seriously displacing me. I can barely receive everything as it is." Ariel's eyes widened in shock, but Derek couldn't resist smiling. "I'd like to perform an exploratory scan on you," he said to the robot, "at your convenience. Would tomorrow morning, first thing, be acceptable?" "Perhaps it is a good thing if you want to scan me," Harry said. "It happens that tomorrow morning is convenient. But might I ask the reasons for why you must play mechanic so soon, or why select me from all the other robots in the city?" I bet people always say much the same thing to their human doctors. Don't worry, your personality integrals won't be fiddled with." "A sorely tempting prospect," put in M334. A sudden interruption startled Derek. He'd almost forgotten about the other two. "Forgive me," he said, "but was that an attempt at sarcasm?" "I have been ruthlessly studying all the tricks," M334 replied. "Ridicule, dramatic irony, hyperbole, and I stand ready to put them at your service at a moment's notice, sir." "No, thank you," Ariel said, smiling. "He's well armed enough on his own." M334 shook its head. "A pity, but no doubt there shall soon become a human to this planet who is in need of my services. Perhaps I shall one day even be permitted to be a valet in the diplomatic corps." Benny raised its hand and put it on M334's shoulder in the same manner it had put it on Harry's. "Hold the life pod, comrade, but might I suggest it is too early in the game to conceive of such grandiose goals?" "Humans do," said M334. "They design their own buildings as well." Derek instinctively stepped back, as if fearing he would be caught in a sudden explosion. Generally, robots' philosophical discussions centered around how best to serve humans in the standards dictated by the three laws. But both Benny and M334 had been talking about their own interests. But if normal speech," he noted, "is that only automatic or for my benefit because I happen to be in the vicinity? Or is there some deeper purpose that I'm unaware of? Come to think of it, what's the deeper point of the discussion? They're doing all this for a reason." Derek inched forward so that he could hear more easily, but before he could hear their next words, Harry stepped between him and them. Harry had performed the aggressive move as politely as possible, but it was exasperating all the same. "Harry, just what do you think you're doing?" "The third law of robotics dictates that I must make an inquiry," he states. "The third law states a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second laws. That would explain the action, but not the impropriety." Derek sighed in surrender. "Yes, Harry? What is it? No, wait a second. Mandelbrot, are you confused by all this?" "Yes." "Then I guess these three are funny." "If you're referring to our earlier conversation, yes, they are." "Thanks. Yes, Harry, what's in your postronic brain?" "Please refrain from misunderstanding me," Harry said, "but I would severely fail to adjust if some random electronic scan disrupted my carefully assembled philosophy of life." "Excuse me, what philosophy of life?" asked Derek, his gut tightening when he realized that, whatever happened next, he had directly asked for it. "Ever since I was switched on, I have striven to perform my 3 rules of life in addition to the 3 laws." "Yes?" said Derek, uncertainly, now really dreading the answer. Harry held out one finger. "Make sure you are closed down for 12 periods of every cycle." 2 fingers. "Never play three-dimensional chess with a robot that has a planet for a first name." 3 fingers. "And never quibble with the logic of a robot that has 16 notches on his beta thruster." Derek stared wide-eyed at the robot in stunned disbelief. "What in the name of the galaxy are you talking about?" "Humor, as opposed to sarcasm. I was attempting to elicit laughter," said the robot in unmistakably defensive tones. "Is not humor one of the personality traits we robots must know and understand if we are to serve humanity properly?" Not necessarily. In fact, it's never been done before, at least to my knowledge. But I don't see how it could hurt, unless the human in question is one of those rare birds who has no funny bone, and hence views laughter as unhealthy or otherwise undesirable. Well, thus far my fellow robots are convinced I have succeeded in the undesirable department. I apologize most abjectly if you find my human jokes severely lacking marrow. I promise to do better next time, especially if you help me to correct my errors, which, after all, may have absolutely nothing to do with my post-neuronic keenness, but with my delivery instead. Is it possible? How say you?" "Tomorrow. Tomorrow first thing, I promise." Without waiting for response, Derek took an equally stunned Ariel by the arm and guided her through the crowd, separating them from the main object of attention. "Are that robot's pathways in the right place?" she whispered. "If they are, then I suggest we dismantle the entire city first chance we get." "Maybe so," replied Ariel, taking a parting glance at Harry. "If we must, I know exactly where to begin." But Derek had already forgotten the matter of Harry and his 2 comrades, for he was finally getting a good look at the calm center of the commotion. A rather slight supervisor robot, slight despite its dull gray chromium surface, which lent a weighty air to the narrow body. The reflection of the building light on its surface was considerably more lackluster than that of the rest. The robot's posture indicated that it was uncertain of how to deal with all this attention. Its arms were crossed timidly over its chestplate, its shoulders slumped, as if its spinal structure had been compromised by a defect. Occasionally it straightened, or pointed a finger, but generally its gestures were hesitant, its verbal pauses frequent, and its level of coherence largely a matter of conjecture. "I fail to understand how you can reach such conclusions through any sort of logic, however spotty," it was saying, apparently in reply to a question from a tall ebony robot that, arms crossed, looked down on it as from a storm cloud. "My pathways have never been clearer, my behavior is as consistent with the spirit of the 3 laws as any robot's on this planet, perhaps more so because I seem to be inherently more cognizant of some of the contradictions inherent in our position." The ebony, whose surface was so dark it was permeated with spectral nuances of unrelenting shadow, shivered with something approaching indignation. For a long moment the two stared at one another, and Derek got the uncomfortable feeling that they were sizing up each other. Derek put his finger to his lips, and when Ariel nodded to show she understood, he stuffed his hands into his back pockets and listened with keen interest. "Perhaps you believe with the utmost sincerity that you have merely been following your duty as properly behooves a robot," said the ebony evenly, "but it is not up to you to decide what your duty is, nor is it up to you to take it upon yourself to redesign the city to meet your own specifications. There's something dangerously anarchistic about your attitude." "I have done what I have done," said the Grey, looking away with a bearing that, had it been human, Dirk could have described as a huff. "I have harmed no robot, no human, and certainly not myself. In fact, if you would care to open your receptors and seek out empirical justification for your opinions, you will see that just thus far I have only expanded the awareness of the robots gathered around. Such expansion of perspective can only be positive." "You cannot prove that," replied the Ebony at once. "You can only surmise it." "One can reasonably assume one is doing the greatest good. True enough, some harm may come from forces one cannot have reasonably predicted, but such a rationale is in and of itself no reason to remain inactive. In any case, the matter is settled for the moment. What is done cannot be undone." "All robots can be ordered to forget, and they will," said the Ebony defiantly. "What I have done is stronger than mere memory," replied the Grey. "What I have done will affect the post-neuronic functioning of every robot that has seen my building. Order them to forget. See if I care." The robot turned as if to walk away. Instead, it paused and said, "But I submit they will be infinitely better off if they do not know why. The confusion of forgetfulness can often lead to overload, and hence disaster. So how does your suggestion conform to the three laws now?" For a long moment the Ebony actually appeared crushed by the question. Then it mustered its posture, took a few steps forward, and put its hand on the chromium robot's shoulder, staring down at it as if it was looking at a crystal through an electron microscope. The Ebony's eyes were so red that they seemed to be comprised of as many floating divisions of overlaid hues as did the planes of the building. "Your building is a remarkably conceptual feat," it said to the Grey. "Could it be you directly copied the building from some pre-existing design?" "Forgive my friend," replied the Grey, "but my conception simply came to me one afternoon. I responded by making it a reality. I would mention that the central computer would have overridden my instructions if I had requested anything conflicting with city programming." "Interesting," replied the Ebony, rubbing its hands together. Derek half expected sparks to fly. "Then how long can we expect this building to stand?" "Until the central computer is given a direct order to wash it away. Only I know the code, however. I imagine it is barely possible that a sufficiently determined critic could discover and override it." The Ebony's eyes brightened. Derek tensed as he watched the Ebony draw itself up to its full height. "This is madness. Illogic runs rampant. Your deeds have irreparably cut the pattern of our existence." "Not at all," said the Grey demurely. "The building was a logical result, something that had impressed my circuits the wrong way, ever since the humans arrived in our city." For the first time it acknowledged the presence of Derek and Ariel with a slight bow. "And surely, if my vision is the logical result of the complex interaction of my postronic pathways, then anything I can come up with, and any deed I can accomplish, is a meet and proper activity, especially if it helps robots better understand the behavioral complexities of humans." "In that case," said the Ebony, "you shall reprogram Central to do away with the building, and then open your brain repository to share your pathway nuances with us. It should never be necessary for you to create again." "He shall do no such thing!" exclaimed Derek. "Hear me, Ebony, whoever you think you are," he added, practically poking his finger in the robot's face. "Until other humans arrive here, or until the engineer who created this city reveals his presence, this building shall remain as long as its creator wishes it to stand. This is a direct order and may not be countermanded by Central or by anyone else. Do you understand? A direct order, and it shall apply to every robot in the city. There shall be no exceptions." The Ebony nodded. "As you wish." Derek could only assume that the Ebony would carry out his orders to the letter. Only an order given by someone else in precedence, Dr. Avery to be precise, or a necessity dictated by the three laws, would permit the building to be reabsorbed now. And to emphasize that fact, lest the Ebony should strive to pinpoint some logical flaw in the command, Derek ignored all other robots, especially the Ebony, in favor of the Grey. He turned to him and asked, "What is your designation?" "Lucius." "Lucius? No number?" "Like many of my comrades, I recently decided that my former designation was no longer adequate." "Yes, there seems to be a lot of that going around lately." All right, Lucius, I think the time has come for you and me to take a little walk." "If that is your command," said Lucius noncommittally. A few moments later, Derek and his three friends were escorting the robot called Lucius from the square. The vast majority of the robots had returned their attention to the building, but Derek was uncomfortably aware of two red metal eyes glaring at him, as if to bore deep into his soul. And thus ends the second chapter, and officially marking the longest video I've uploaded yet. Whew. Uh, I hope you all have enjoyed, and the author is definitely using much bigger words than the previous authors, if you can't tell. Yeah, it also definitely has a very sophisticated British high society feel to the way everyone's talking. Like, honestly. Anyway, hope you enjoyed. Next part will be next Saturday, and yeah, happy December.